This time we're discussing the influence of thoughts on water. I'm Angel.
And I'm Matisse. Today, we're looking into something pretty fascinating and honestly quite controversial. Masaru Emoto's claims about thoughts and emotions changing the very structure of water.
Exactly. And the big question really is this. Can our intentions, things like words, music, even just focused thought, can they genuinely alter water's physical properties? Like, can we actually see it in frozen water crystals? Does it affect biological stuff like fermentation? And maybe even more importantly, Matisse, is there a plausible scientific framework, maybe something like TGD-inspired quantum biology, that could even begin to explain this?
Right. It's a huge claim.
It is, and I'll be arguing that, well, yes, these effects, or at least the reports of them, they're real enough to explore seriously. I think they point towards a really radical new understanding of physics and biology, involving consciousness, maybe even dark matter interacting with water in a unique way.
Okay. And I'll be taking the perhaps more conventional stance. While the theory Angel mentioned is, well, it's intricate, I'll argue that the original claims by Emoto just don't hold up to basic scientific scrutiny. We're talking about a lack of rigor, problems with reproducibility, things that make it really difficult to accept these claims from a standard scientific perspective.
Okay, well, let's get into it. From my perspective, Matisse, we should really take Emoto's findings as a starting point, a working hypothesis. The idea that water exposed to positive vibes, words like love, gratitude, tends to form these beautiful, symmetrical crystals, while negative stuff results in messy, ugly structures. Now, the theoretical basis for this, at least within topological geometrodynamics, or TGD, is actually quite developed. It suggests these effects are potentially real. They involve something called the magnetic body, or MB, which carries dark matter with a different effective Planck constant, interacting with the biological body, or BB. And water is absolutely key here. It's essential for life, obviously. But TGD suggests it exists in a kind of quantum critical state. Think about it. Near freezing or even at body temperature, Pollack's work on exclusion zones, or EZs, points to this too. This quantum criticality makes water incredibly sensitive to subtle influences like intention. The idea is that the water sample and the person thinking the thought become entangled, connected via these flux tubes involving their magnetic bodies, forming a larger conscious system. And this system can express emotions universally through something TGD calls bioharmony.
Okay, Angel, I hear the complexity of the TGD model, but I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because the foundation, the actual Emoto experiments is frankly shaky from a methodological standpoint. The core claims, they really suffer from fundamental flaws. Critics consistently point out the lack of strict scientific controls. Probably the biggest one is the absence of double-blind procedures. If the person taking the picture knows which water got the love label and then gets to pick the best-looking crystal photo out of maybe 100, well, that introduces massive bias. It's experimenter prejudice, plain and simple. And then there's the selective reporting, only showing the pretty pictures. Plus basic things like controlling air humidity, temperature gradients during freezing. These are critical factors for crystal formation, and they often weren't rigorously controlled. It really undermines any objective assessment of the crystal aesthetics. Even later attempts to replicate it, like the study by Radin you sometimes hear about, often rely on these subjective aesthetic appeal scores. And honestly, many details like the true sample size of photos shown to judges remain questionable. It just highlights how difficult it is to scientifically verify claims based on subjective beauty.
That's an interesting point about the controls, Matisse, though I might frame it a bit differently. You see, this persistent skepticism, it often pops up when scientists investigate phenomena that challenge the mainstream materialist view. Things like water memory, remote mental interactions, they often get labeled pariah phenomena. Is the resistance purely about scientific objectivity? Or is there sometimes an ideological resistance baked in? And think about the so-called experimenter effect itself. This isn't necessarily fraud. It's a documented effect where the researcher's own desire or expectation, maybe even subconsciously, seems to influence the outcome. If that effect is real, and some studies suggest it is, doesn't that actually support the core idea that intention matters? It could be seen as a confirmation of the kind of remote mental interactions Emoto's work implies, if true.
Okay, but framing the lack of rigor as potentially evidence for the phenomenon feels circular, Angel. The refusal, for instance, for Emoto's work to be submitted to rigorous, conventional peer review, or the silence around the James Randi $1 Million Challenge, which specifically required properly controlled conditions, that suggests an avoidance of accountability, doesn't it? Scientific claims, especially extraordinary ones, must be verifiable and reproducible under conditions that eliminate bias as much as possible. Otherwise, how do we distinguish a real effect from wishful thinking or experimental artifacts?
You're right that standard verification is the goal, but maybe the standard methods aren't sufficient for phenomena where consciousness is an active participant. The TGD perspective doesn't see the experimenter effect as just noise to be eliminated. It sees it as part of the physics, mediated by this magnetic body connection, which actually leads us to the mechanism. If intention influences water, how? This brings us to that TGD concept of bioharmony. So we really need to ask, what are key elements for the influence of thoughts on water?
Okay, lay out the TGD explanation then.
All right, so the primary element is this interaction between the subject's magnetic body. Think of it as a field body carrying layers of dark matter, specifically dark protons, stabilized because they have a much larger effective Planck constant, written as HFF equals N. This MB connects to the water, which, remember, is in that sensitive quantum critical state using these things called magnetic flux tubes. Essentially, the person and the water become a single, larger conscious system for that moment.
Angel, this is a huge leap, isn't it? We're going way beyond standard physics here. Dark matter physics, flux tubes. Just explain why someone thinks a water crystal looks nice.
But hold on, Matisse. It gets incredibly specific about how emotion translates to physical effect. That's the bioharmony part. It proposes a kind of code, mapping the 64 codons of our genetic code onto musical chords, specifically 3 chords defined by the symmetries of geometric shapes like the icosahedron and tetrahedron. Emotions in this model are literally realized at a molecular level, expressed perhaps as sequences of dark protons or as 3 chords of dark photons traveling along those flux tubes. It suggests a universal language of emotion written in physics and geometry.
A universal language based on geometric music? Okay. How does that relate to the crystals looking pretty or ugly?
That's the crux of it. Positive emotions, things like love, gratitude, they correspond to harmonies with high degrees of symmetry. The most beautiful symmetrical crystals, the hexagonal ones often shown, are theorized to resonate with a specific harmony that has Z6 symmetry. That represents maximal information coherence, maximal neginentropy stability. Conversely, negative intentions create disharmonies. These are like Hamilton cycles in the geometry that lack symmetry, maybe just Z1. These disharmonies introduce incoherence, chaos, leading to faster decay and those messy, unstructured ice patterns. It implies a fundamental principle. The influence of thoughts on water requires consistent positive energy to be active and healthy.
Okay, the theoretical mapping is certainly intricate, but it requires believing that the meaning or emotional content of a word or a piece of music gets reliably translated into a specific physical signal, these dark photons, that then travels and affects water clusters outside the body. We're asked to accept, based purely on someone's visual aesthetic judgment of a photo, that my voice saying thank you reliably generates, say, a Z6 dark photon signal, while saying I hate you generates a Z1 signal. We just lack any independent empirical proof of that entire translation mechanism. The negentropy argument is interesting, but it seems entirely self-contained within the TGD theory itself, making it hard to verify externally.
Okay, fair point on the direct detection of dark photons. But let's shift to the biological implications, Matisse. These might be even more compelling than the crystals because they supposedly happen at normal temperatures, where TGD also says water is quantum critical. So let's ask, how can the influence of thoughts on water be seen biologically? Think about those experiments with jars of cooked rice.
Ah, yes, the Rice experiments.
Right. Now, obviously, controls are important here too, but the reported pattern is striking. Rice in jars labeled with friendly words like thank you tends to ferment. Fermentation is a metabolic process, a basic sign of life, right? It's consuming sugar without oxygen. But the rice exposed to negative words like you fool tends to just rot and turn black. This difference, if real, strongly suggests the emotional tone acts like a kind of control signal, influencing how metabolic processes unfold.
Angel, you're listening to OOTO TV with research by author Paul Bulow.
Thanks, Matisse. Now back to the rice fermentation versus rotting.
Okay, it's certainly a provocative observation, but attributing fermentation specifically to friendly words requires enormous leaps in our understanding. You're implicitly suggesting that the subjective emotional tone is directly controlling cellular respiration. And the proposed mechanism involves that large effective Planck constant, HF equals N/Ne, and these exclusion zones from Pollack's work. These are concepts way outside mainstream accepted biological chemistry and physics pathways. We don't have a standard model for how a word's vibration or intention flips a metabolic switch like that.
But the TGD mechanism offers an explanation, Matisse. It suggests why you might get coherent life processes like fermentation versus chaotic decay like rotting. Friendly words corresponding to high symmetry bioharmony increase the system's negotropy. That means more structure, more information, more coherence, leading to efficient use of metabolic energy. Negative words induce disharmony, a loss of coherence, essentially starving the system metabolically, may be analogous to how psychological states like depression can manifest physically, affecting appetite and energy. The implication for us is potentially huge. Exposure to healthy influence of thoughts on water improves your social mood and mental ability to share ideas and thoughts. The intention is setting the potential for the system's efficiency.
It's an ambitious interpretation, linking emotion to negoentropy and metabolism that way. But we keep hitting the same experimental wall, Angel. When you state that the influence of thoughts on water requires a healthy amount of positive attitude to facilitate best results, aren't you essentially building the need for the experimenter to believe in the effect into the protocol itself? That positive attitude becomes a critical, uncontrolled variable. It perfectly illustrates the experimenter bias that conventional science tries so hard to eliminate. If the effect conveniently disappears when a skeptic tries the experiment without the right attitude, it might confirm the experimenter effect, but it doesn't confirm the objective physical reality of the water itself changing, independent of the observer's desire.
I see it differently, Matisse. It confirms the reality of the phenomenon as a conscious interaction. It's not just water in a beaker, it's a coupled system, the observer and the observed, linked by these flux tubes. The quality of that coupling, the coherence of the interaction, depends on the intention. So yes, maybe the influence of thoughts on water requires the ability to have periods of calm, thoughtful focus to be at maximum productive health. That focused positive intent generates the high symmetry harmony needed for coherence, whether it's in crystal structure or in metabolic function like fermentation. The challenge isn't necessarily that the science is wrong, but maybe that our definition of objective science needs to expand to fundamentally include consciousness as a physical factor.
I do understand the internal consistency you're describing within the TGD framework, Angel. It does provide a coherent, albeit highly unconventional model, where emotional tone, encoded as this bioharmony, could theoretically act as a control signal for both physical structure and biological activity.
Exactly. We have, or at least TGD proposes, a potentially unified framework. It connects water's unique properties, quantum mechanics, dark matter concepts, and consciousness to explain these very controversial claims. This idea of bioharmony, it offers a really powerful, though speculative, lens for thinking about how consciousness might influence matter right down to the molecular level. It suggests that ordered, positive intention could be physically manifest through geometric symmetry and negentropic energy use.
Okay, while the theoretical model, the magnetic bodies, the bioharmony, the dark matter aspects is undeniably fascinating and comprehensively developed, we have to circle back to the foundation. The original Emoto experiments, which sparked this whole discussion, remain scientifically weak. The methodological issues, the lack of blinding, inadequate control of crucial environmental factors, the deep reliance on subjective aesthetic judgments, these haven't really been resolved to the satisfaction of the broader scientific community. So until we see convincing, reproducible, and objectively measured data that is demonstrably independent of the experimenter's hopes or beliefs, well, the most responsible position, I think, still has to be one of intellectual skepticism about the physical reality of the phenomenon itself. The value here, perhaps, lies more in pushing theoretical boundaries and exploring these complex models rather than claiming definitive validation of the original, highly questionable experimental results.
A challenging perspective, Matisse, but a necessary one in this debate. It certainly highlights the gap between intriguing possibilities and established scientific fact.
And perhaps exploring that gap is where the real work lies.